For the remainder of the videos, we're going to explore each of the endocrine glands or tissues independently and in a little bit more detail. In this one, we're going to start with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland because they are so closely related to each other. And granted, this is probably the most complicated and detailed part of the chapter, but it really sets you up well for making the rest of the chapter go by easier. So take your time with this and make sure that you understand it before you go on. So the hypothalamus, we've called before being our master gland. It's going to be secreting hormones that are controlling almost all of the other glands in our body. It's going to sit on the anteroinferior diencephalon. So here's our thalamus over here. That's part of the diencephalon. So the hypothalamus, of course, is sitting just anterior and a little bit below it. It's going to sit right above that pituitary gland right here. It's going to be the interface between the nervous and the endocrine system. It's sitting literally right in between the two. So it's part of both. It's not only going to be sending stuff out, but it's also going to be receiving information in from many other parts of our body. So we have the reticular activating system here in our brainstem, our limbic system, which is important for all of our emotions and control, from the cerebral cortex, accounting for our motor and sensory activity, language, vision, higher executive functioning. It's going to get information from our thalamus, from all of our internal organs coming up through our vagus nerve and different cranial nerves, and information from our eyes. So it's taking all of that information and it's figuring out what to do, and it's going to be sending out different types of hormones or different neurons to stimulate reactions in different parts of our body. So the hypothalamus controls our autonomic nervous system. I'm just listing a few of them here for you. I mean, it's going to be controlling our body temperature, thirst, hunger, sexual behavior, how we grow and develop, our defense reactions, so all that stuff involved with the limbic system, the fear and range and recognition of danger, and how that's all tied to emotion. So all of that is going to be controlling all of these different hormones that we put out. And it's going to have basically three different routes of control. It's going to regulate hormones coming out of the anterior pituitary gland. So here's our little pituitary gland here, and you're going to see that we're going to divide it up into an anterior section and a posterior section. For the anterior section, the hypothalamus is going to put out hormones that travel in the bloodstream and come down here, and they're going to control the release of hormones that are made in the anterior pituitary gland. It's also going to make hormones that are going to come down through neurons that are going to release those hormones directly into the bloodstream. And those hormones are going to be oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And we're going to look at these guys in detail. They're getting released from the posterior pituitary gland. And it's also going to control part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And you've seen that before with our sympathetic nervous system. So the hypothalamus is actually going to be controlling those preganglionic motor fibers going to the medulla oblongata, where they synapse on chromaffin cells and send out epinephrine and norepinephrine. We're going to look at all of these in a lot more detail, but I wanted to give you this overview picture first. So the hypothalamus, sitting here in the anterior inferior below the diencephalon, it's going to have what we call a little infundibulum, or a stalk, that's going to connect it directly to the pituitary gland. And it's connecting it to the posterior pituitary, not the anterior pituitary. And that's going to be very important, and you're going to see why in just a second. That posterior pituitary gland is going to put out hormones, and you can see how this got little capillary beds sitting right around that posterior pituitary gland that the hormones are going to secrete out into. And the anterior pituitary is going to have its own capillary bed. It's going to secrete at least 7 different hormones that we're going to look at. And this is why this part of the chapter gets complicated. But what I want you to recognize here in this picture is that you're going to have this capillary system up here in the hypothalamus, and it's going to have a little pathway that goes to the anterior pituitary, but not the posterior pituitary. I'm about to show you why. But first, let me just show you a little mid-sagittal section of this whole thing in a cadaver. So I've outlined here in yellow for you the pituitary gland. It's going to have an anterior and posterior component to it. It's sitting right in that sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And in fact, you can see, remember that sphenoid bone that looked like a big butterfly, and the body of it was actually hollow, and I told you that there was a sinus in there. Well, that's what you're seeing here, is a sphenoid sinus of the sphenoid bone. If we look posteriorly, we can see here's our pons. And if we look more posterior, here's our fourth ventricle. And you can just barely see a little bit of that cerebellum there. If you go superiorly, we'd be in the midbrain. So we'd have our cerebral peduncle here and our tectum with our superior and inferior colliculus there. And then way above all that is going to be our diencephalon. So here's our thalamus up here with our hypothalamus, and you can see a bunch of nuclei in there, and then this little stalk called the infundibulum leading down to the posterior pituitary gland. These slides down here are just a little bit of leftovers. They're the name of cells that are going to be releasing different hormones from these glands. And I'm not going to make you responsible for knowing these, but we may refer back to them once in a while. So we've got somatotrophs that are dealing with somatostatin, thyrotrophs that are releasing hormones for your thyroid. Gonadotrophs are going to be cells that are making hormones for your gonadotrophins, which you're going to find out are different types of luteinizing and follicular or follicle stimulating hormones. Lactotrophs, which are going to be, if you think of the lactate, that's going to be having to do with making milk. And corticotrophs are going to be going to the corticotrophic part of the adrenal medulla, the cortex of the, not the adrenal medulla, of the adrenal gland. So let's take a minute to just look at how that pituitary gland actually develops, because it's really pretty fascinating. If you imagine this here is a little 4-week-old, 28-day embryo, you can kind of remember we had our prosencephalon, we'll have our mesencephalon, and our rhombencephalon. And just anterior to that, we're going to have basically the esophagus growing up here. And that esophagus is going to have these different pouches in it. We call them pharyngeal pouches. This is going to be kind of in your throat area. And at the very tippy top of that, we're going to have something called a hypophyseal pouch or Rathke's pouch. That's going to be growing as part of, you can see it turn into the anterior pituitary gland, separately from a little bud that's growing out of the prosencephalon that will eventually turn into the diencephalon. This is going to be a neurohypophyseal bud, and that will eventually turn into our posterior pituitary gland. So let's kind of take a different picture of it down here. Here you can see that this Rathke's pouch or hypophyseal pouch is growing up out of what's going to be the mouth cavity. So it's growing up from there, and this neurohypophyseal bud is growing down out of what's going to be the diencephalon. So they're kind of growing opposite directions of each other. And as this one comes down from the diencephalon, you can see it's going to make a little bud here, and the kind of the part that's leading to it, that's what becomes the infundibulum. And so this is going to end up becoming the posterior pituitary gland, which is a direct descendant of that hypothalamus. And then we're going to have the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to be coming up from the roof of the mouth. So the posterior pituitary we call the neurohypophysis because it's coming out of the brain, essentially. It's coming from the nervous system. And the anterior hypophysis is going to be connected by blood vessels instead of neurons coming down here. Okay, so now we can recognize that this hypophysis, which is the whole name for the pituitary gland, which is sitting in that sella turcica, it's connected to the hypothalamus by what we've called the infundibulum so far, which is that whole connective tissue surrounding the nerves here. And the nerves that are coming down, or the neurons, are going to be given a special name. This is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Big long word. Hypothalamo just refers to the hypothalamus, so this section up here. Hypophyseal is referring to the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract is the actual neurons that are coming through. So it's a direct pathway, and these neurons are going to secrete their oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And you can see that right here. So in the hypothalamus, we're going to have these nuclei. One of them is called the supraoptic nucleus, another is a paraventricular nucleus. I don't need you to be super familiar with which does which, but they're both going to be, and actually depending on the sources that you read, some sources say they both do at least a little bit of each. These guys are, this is going to be where our oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are made, in the hypothalamus. But if these are neurons, it's going to be made in the cell bodies of those neurons, and then it's going to travel down their axons, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, down into this posterior pituitary gland. And it's going to release those hormones, those chemicals, directly into the blood. That's why they're hormones, because they're being released directly into these blood capillaries. And then from here, it'll flow out to the rest of your body. Hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And this is releasing oxytocin, which is going to be responsible for those uterine contractions that we talked about. It's going to be responsible for milk secretion, and I'm just going to make a differentiation. We've got different hormones, prolactin hormone that's going to make the milk, but it's the oxytocin that's going to squeeze it out. So think about oxytocin as being a squeezer. It's going to squeeze the baby out, it's going to squeeze the milk out. Contractions. Also related to orgasm, another kind of squeezing, right? It's also related to cuddling. So after sex, after orgasm, there's kind of a sense to cuddle more. And I'm going to tell you, men have oxytocin as well as women. It's just not a female thing. But maybe some men don't have quite as much oxytocin as others. Not trying to make an excuse for anybody, but that's going to be part of the cuddling effect, is this oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone, or commonly referred to as ADH, is going to have an effect on the water retention in your kidney. So when you need to retain water, your body will secrete more ADH. And this is what happens with people who drink too much alcohol, or not, it could just be a lot of some alcohol, is alcohol inhibits the central nervous system. So if the central nervous system is slowed down, it's not going to be secreting as much ADH as it normally would. As a result, you won't be retaining water as much as you normally would, so you end up peeing a lot more of it out. That's why alcohol makes you pee more, because you're inhibiting the ADH production. Okay, so we'll move on to the anterior pituitary gland, and this is where it gets a little more complicated. The anterior pituitary gland is going to be 75% of the pituitary by weight. So a lot more going on there, it tells you already. The hormones in the anterior pituitary gland are regulated by these releasing and inhibiting hormones that we see up in the hypothalamus. So here's another picture of the hypothalamus, and now I've put in here a lot more nuclei that are making hormones, and these hormones are going to control the hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. I do not expect you to memorize and know the names of each of these nuclei. I certainly don't, and exactly what they do. But we will become familiar with the hormones that are being produced in there. So before we had the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, now we're going to have the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So of a portal system, you think about, I don't know if any of you have ever had to carry a canoe before, but you port it between one stream and another stream when you run out of water. A portal is basically just a way of shuttling something from one place to another. And that's what we're going to be doing here with the anterior pituitary gland. So we start off with a capillary bed called the primary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system. This capillary bed is going to be surrounding the base of the hypothalamus here. And all of these nuclei that are making hormones are going to be secreting them into this primary plexus, or this capillary bed surrounding the base of the hypothalamus. Then it's going to send those into this one little vein here called the portal vein. So it's not going out to the whole body yet. It's just going out to this little vein that's going to transport these hormones to the anterior pituitary gland. And here we've got another capillary bed. This is called the secondary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system. So in this plexus now, These hormones are going to have their effect on the anterior pituitary gland, and then we're going to have a bunch of cells in this anterior pituitary gland that are making other hormones. So these hormones released from the hypothalamus are going to cause the hormones in the anterior pituitary to either be released or it will stop them. It will inhibit some of them from being released, depending on what that hormone is. So this is the portal system, hypophyseal portal system going to the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, this is a big picture. There's a lot going on here, but I'm going to make it really simple for you. This top part up here is all about what's going on in the hypothalamus. And the main thing I want you to recognize here is that we're going to have releasing hormones. We're going to have a lot of releasing hormones and some inhibiting hormones. And we're going to go over these in more detail in physiology. But for right now, I want you to recognize that these hormones up here, and for the most part, they all have the name releasing in them, and that's going to give you a big hint that they're coming from the hypothalamus. So we've got this corticotropin releasing hormone. Well, that's going to have an effect on adrenocorticotropic hormone. See, they have kind of similar names here. These guys are going to cause these guys to be released, and the adrenocorticotropic hormones are going to go have an effect on the adrenal gland and the corticotropic steroids or hormones in this adrenal cortex here. Thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to have thyroid, it sounds kind of like thyroid, it's going to have an effect on thyroid stimulating hormone, which is being released from the anterior pituitary. Thyroid stimulating, it's going to go down to the thyroid and stimulate hormones from that get released. So it's this big long chain reaction. Gonadotropin, you've got releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. They're going to have an effect on your gonadotropic hormones in your anterior pituitary gland or anterior pituitary. Those gonadotropes are going to be luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. And they're going to each have an effect on the testes and the ovaries, making different hormones and causing a few different things to happen. And we're going to look at that in more detail. We've got prolactin, which is going to be affecting the milk production. So you're going to be either increasing or inhibiting that milk production. So prolactin is going to affect the mom. And then we're going to have somatostatins, which are going to influence our growth hormone, which are going to cause us to grow, or it's going to inhibit it. So we're going to spend pretty much the rest of all the videos looking at all these different factors and how they work. So here's our target glands down here coming after the anterior pituitary. And they're going to have an effect down here. All these glands are going to be making more hormones. They're going to have an effect throughout our body. We're going to look at all those. So this I just put together for you to kind of test yourself. So make sure when you're looking at the PowerPoint slides, you put it in slideshow mode, and you can just go through this with yourself. Think about growth hormone. Its target is going to be primarily the liver and adipose tissues, but really all cells in your body will have receptors for growth hormone because they're all going to be involved in growth. So it's stimulating growth and metabolism. Prolactin is going to the mammary glands. It's going to be making milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to be going to the thyroid gland. It's going to be secreting thyroid hormone, which is going to be managing a lot of the metabolism and energy management in your body. Follicular stimulating hormone, it's going to go to the ovaries and testes. In the ovaries, it's going to develop what's the oocyte or the egg, and the follicle is the little shell that protects that egg, or I call the suitcase kind of thing. And when we go over the reproductive system, we're going to spend a lot of time on this. In the testes, it's just going to be developing sperm. Luteinizing hormone also goes to the gonads. In the ovaries, it's going to be the main thing that's setting off ovulation, or getting that egg out of the ovary into the fallopian tube on its way to the uterus. It's going to make other hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and manage what used to be the follicle housing that egg, which is going to be called the corpus luteum, and we'll get to that with the reproductive system as well. In the testes, main hormone we're making is testosterone. In the adrenal gland, so the adrenal gland has two main parts, the cortex and the medulla that you're going to see. This is going to be managing the cortex, and we're going to have a lot of glucocorticoids and another hormone, melanocyte stimulating hormone, that we'll talk about there. And that stimulating hormone, again, can affect the brain and different parts of the skin here. So take a look at this and review it on your own, because we're going to be going over this again and again and again. So you want to know what all these hormones are doing, what their target organ is, and what their effect will be. Here, these last two slides, I've just put a picture up so that you can kind of see and visualize them all together. I won't go over each of them separately, except to remember that posterior pituitary is going to be ADH and oxytocin. Anterior pituitary is going to be everything else here. And just another way of representing the same thing, you got your posterior pituitary making ADH and oxytocin, which will affect the smooth muscle in the uterus and also in the mammary glands to expel either the baby or the milk. And anterior pituitary is going everywhere else that we're going to be talking about today. Just to kind of wrap it up on a clinical note, if you have a disorder of growth hormone, there's a couple different ways it can affect you. Obviously, this is part of the endocrine system. If you have somebody who's a dwarf, and there's different types of dwarfism, but one of them can be caused by having too little growth hormone as a child. I think a dwarf is defined as somebody who's 4'10" or less, and so they just never get enough of that hormone in their body to make their cells grow. The opposite of that would be giantism, where you have too much growth hormone as a child, and in this case, it's before those epiphyseal plates close. So it's going to allow those long bones to get really long. This can make someone become very tall and very big. This guy's fairly thin, but you can also have, you don't have to be thin as a result of giantism, because many of your cells will be growing in different ways. It can also cause many different problems and cause things to stretch inside the body too much and cause different types of aneurysms, and we may talk about that at some point in class. A lot of times basketball players may have trouble with this as well. Acromegaly is kind of like giantism, except it's when you have too much growth hormone produced after those epiphyseal plates close. And this could be a result of a tumor or overproduction of, and tumors can make hormones be produced too much. And in that case, the long bones aren't going to grow anymore, but they'll see problems with increased growth in the bones of the hands, or especially like the jaw and some of the bones of the face and head will continue to grow and cause some problems that way. So that kind of wraps up this section. Again, take your time going over some of those hormones from the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary and recognize what they do, and then that's going to set you up for the rest of this chapter.